My name is Tommy Reeves, and I'm going to tell you about the night my father lost everything to a rigged poker game. The 3 years he spent drinking himself to death because of it, and the 7 years after his funeral I spent learning to beat casino owners at their own game. This isn't about violence or dramatic confrontations. It's about mathematics, patience, and watching greedy men destroy themselves chasing money they think they've already won. I was 19 when my father, Robert Reeves, walked into the Golden Palace Casino in Atlantic City with $50,000. It was everything we had. Money from selling our house, his retirement fund, savings he'd built over 30 years working construction. He'd been invited to a private high-stakes poker game by Vincent Calabrese, the casino owner, who'd heard my father was a skilled player. My father was good at poker. He'd played semi-professionally for years, won enough small tournaments that people knew his name in certain circles. He was careful, mathematical, never bet more than he could afford to lose. But Vincent had convinced him this was different, a chance to play with serious money against serious players, a chance to change our lives. I begged him not to go. Something felt wrong about the invitation, about Vincent's sudden interest in a small-time player like my dad. But Dad was excited, said this was his shot, that he'd be careful, that he knew what he was doing. He lost everything in 6 hours. He came home at 4 in the morning, looking like he'd aged a decade. He sat at our kitchen table and told me what happened. The game had been rigged. Not obviously, not in ways he could prove, but he knew. The cards fell too perfectly for Vincent's friends. The river cards came too conveniently. The odds broke wrong too consistently. They set me up, he said, his voice hollow. Vincent invited me specifically to take my money. They saw me as an easy mark, someone with just enough to be worth cheating, but not enough connections to fight back. We'll report it, I said. Go to the gaming commission, get lawyers. Dad laughed bitterly. With what money? And who'll believe me? Vincent owns half the politicians in this city. The gaming commission investigators probably play golf with him. I'm just a construction worker who lost at cards. That's the story everyone will believe. He was right. We tried anyway. Filed complaints with the gaming commission, talked to lawyers who all said the same thing. Without proof, without witnesses willing to testify, without resources to fight, we had nothing. The gaming commission investigated for 3 weeks and found no evidence of wrongdoing. Case closed. The investigator who handled our case, a man named Donald Pierce, barely looked at the evidence we presented. He spent 20 minutes interviewing my father, asked a few perfunctory questions, then closed the file. Later, I'd learned that Pierce played in Vincent's private games regularly, was one of the Confederates who helped rig them. He'd dismissed my father's complaint because he was part of the scheme. My father started drinking. Not socially, not casually, but desperately, trying to drown the knowledge that he'd been cheated, that he'd lost everything his family owned, that there was nothing he could do about it. He'd wake up shaking, pour whiskey into his morning coffee, tell me the same story over and over about how the cards had fallen, how he'd known something was wrong but couldn't prove it. I watched him apply for jobs and get rejected when background checks revealed our eviction, our financial collapse. I watched him borrow money from friends and lose it on scratch tickets, desperately trying to win back what he'd lost. I watched him shrink, physically and mentally, until the strong, careful man who'd raised me was gone, replaced by someone I barely recognized. He lost his construction job 6 months after that poker game, unable to show up sober or on time. His hands shook too badly to hold tools steady. His foreman, a man who'd worked with Dad for 15 years, called me aside one day. "I'm sorry, Tommy," he said. "I tried to cover for him as long as I could. But he's a liability now. I can't keep him on the crew." We lost our apartment 4 months after that. I was working 2 jobs, trying to keep us afloat, but it wasn't enough. We moved into a weekly motel, 1 room with stained carpets and a bathroom that never quite got clean. Dad slept on the bed. I slept on the floor. He'd wake up at 3 a.m. yelling about the rigged game, about Vincent's smile, about the way the cards had turned. I tried to get him into rehab, into AA meetings, into therapy. He'd go for a week or 2, stay sober just long enough to give me hope, then relapse. The pattern repeated until I stopped hoping, just focused on survival, on making sure he had food and shelter even as he drank away whatever money I managed to earn. I was 21 when I came back to the motel room and found him unconscious on the bathroom floor. I called an ambulance, rode with him to the hospital, Listened to doctors tell me his liver was failing, that years of heavy drinking had destroyed it, that he needed to stop immediately or he'd die. Dad lasted another year. A year of hospitalizations and false starts, of promises to quit and broken resolutions. A year of watching him fade, his skin yellowing, his mind clouding, his body giving up. He died on a Tuesday afternoon, alone in a hospital room because I'd been at work trying to pay his medical bills. He was 52 years old. I stood at his funeral in a suit I'd borrowed from a coworker. The service was small, poorly attended. Most of Dad's friends had drifted away during his decline, unable or unwilling to watch his self-destruction. His construction crew sent flowers, but nobody came. It was me, two of his old poker buddies, and a priest who'd never met him reading generic platitudes about eternal rest. I was 22, broke, angry, and completely alone. I stood at that grave and made a decision. Vincent Calabrese had killed my father as surely as if he'd pulled a trigger, and I was going to make him pay. But I wasn't stupid. I couldn't just walk into the Golden Palace and accuse Vincent of cheating. I couldn't fight him with money or lawyers or connections I didn't have. I needed something else. I needed to become someone Vincent would never suspect, someone who could get close enough to destroy him from the inside. So I started dealing cards. I got a job at a small casino in Pennsylvania, learned the mechanics of every game, studied how dealers control pace and flow, watched how casinos manage risk. I was good at it, fast hands and a mathematical mind, traits I'd inherited from my father. The muscle memory came naturally, shuffle and deal, thousands of repetitions until my hands moved without conscious thought. I worked 60-hour weeks, taking every shift offered, learning everything I could. I studied the other dealers, the good ones and the bad ones, figuring out what made some dealers valuable and others replaceable. I learned to read players, to spot card counters, to manage difficult personalities at the table. I learned the invisible skills, how to keep a game moving, how to defuse tension, how to make high rollers feel valued. But I was learning more than dealing. I was learning how casinos work, how they protect against cheating, where their vulnerabilities are, how money flows through the building. I studied security systems, camera blind spots, employee protocols. I learned the language of the industry, the relationships between owners and regulators, the ways rules get bent for high rollers. I took courses at community college, studying statistics and probability, formalizing the mathematical intuition my father had taught me. I learned about game theory, about optimal strategies, about the mathematical edges that casinos maintain. I learned how to calculate odds in real time, how to spot patterns in seemingly random events, how to recognize when statistics deviate too far from expectation. And I learned about Vincent Calabrese. Vincent owned 3 casinos now, the Golden Palace and 2 others he'd acquired in the years since he'd cheated my father. He was expanding, ambitious, always looking for the next opportunity. He had a reputation as a savvy businessman, someone who knew how to extract maximum profit from every operation. Business magazines profiled him, called him a gaming industry innovator. Politicians courted his endorsements and his donations. He also had a reputation for pushing boundaries, for finding ways around regulations, for playing close to the edge of legality. Nothing provable, nothing that stuck, but whispers followed him. Stories about games that seemed too good to be true, about players who'd lost suspiciously large amounts, about regulatory complaints that mysteriously disappeared. I found 3 other cases similar to my father's. Men who'd been invited to private games, who'd lost everything, who'd complained about rigging and been dismissed. One had filed a lawsuit and lost, his lawyer outmatched by Vincent's legal team. Another had gone to the media and been quietly discredited. Rumors spread about gambling addiction and sour grapes. The third had simply disappeared, moved away from Atlantic City, and was never heard from again. My father hadn't been Vincent's first victim. He'd just been the one Vincent hadn't worried about, the one without resources to fight back, the one whose death could be written off as personal weakness rather than the consequence of theft. I spent 5 years building my skills, building my reputation, building the knowledge I'd need. I worked at 7 different casinos across 3 states, learned from the best dealers and the smartest operators. I saved every dollar I could, lived cheap in shared apartments with other casino workers, ate ramen and rice, never went out, stayed focused. I wasn't just learning a trade. I was preparing for war. During those 5 years, I also learned about Vincent's operation at a deeper level. I talked to dealers who'd worked at the Golden Palace, asked careful questions about the private games, about how high rollers were treated, about which employees were trusted with sensitive assignments. I learned that Vincent ran his rigged games once or twice a month, that the same core group of Confederates played in most of them, that security was carefully managed to avoid documentation. I learned that Vincent's dealer for those games, a man named Frank Morrison, was getting older, had health problems, might not be able to work much longer. Frank was the key, the dealer who controlled the mechanics of the cheating. When Frank retired or couldn't work anymore, there'd be an opening. That was my opportunity. I also spent those years documenting everything I learned. I kept notebooks full of information about Vincent's operation, about the people involved, about the methods used. I collected news articles about his business dealings, tracked his casino acquisitions, mapped his network of associates. I was building a file, gathering ammunition for when the time came to strike. When I was 27, I applied for a dealer position at the Golden Palace. Vincent didn't interview dealers personally, but I made sure my application highlighted my skills, my experience at high-end casinos, my ability to manage difficult players. I had references from shift managers at 3 different properties, all vouching for my reliability and skill. I got the job. Walking into the Golden Palace for the first time as an employee felt surreal. This was where my father had lost everything, where Vincent had set the trap that eventually killed him. I'd imagined this moment for 5 years, wondered how I'd react, whether I'd feel rage or fear or satisfaction. Instead, I felt cold clarity. This wasn't about emotion anymore. This was about execution. I had a role to play, a person to become, and I needed to do it perfectly. Any mistake, any sign that I was anything other than a competent dealer looking for good work, and the whole plan would collapse. I started on low-stakes tables, proved myself reliable and skilled. I was friendly with other dealers, learned their names and their stories, became part of the team. I was professional with security, always on time, always properly uniformed, always following protocols exactly. I was invisible to management, just another good employee, nothing memorable, nothing suspicious. The Golden Palace was larger than I'd expected, 3 floors of gaming space with hundreds of tables and thousands of slot machines. The private game room where my father had been cheated was on the top floor, accessible only by a special elevator that required a key card. I didn't have access yet, wasn't even supposed to know it existed. But I'd seen it on the building plans I'd researched, knew where it was, knew what happened there. After 6 months, I was moved to medium-stakes tables. The shift manager, a woman named Patricia Hernandez, told me I was doing excellent work, that I had a future at the Golden Palace if I wanted it. I thanked her, said I was happy to be there, that I appreciated the opportunity. All true, in a way, though not for the reasons she thought. I volunteered for extra shifts, came in early, stayed late. I made myself indispensable, the dealer who could always cover a call-out, who could handle difficult players, who never caused problems. I learned the rhythms of the casino, when it was busy and when it was slow, which shifts were desirable and which were punishment. I learned the politics, who was respected and who was tolerated, which managers had Vincent's ear and which were just holding positions. After a year, I was dealing blackjack and poker for higher rollers, players betting thousands of dollars per hand. I developed a reputation for being unflappable, for keeping games moving smoothly even when players were drunk or aggressive or down massive amounts. The high rollers started requesting me specifically, liked that I was professional but not stiff, competent but not condescending. This was crucial. Vincent noticed dealers that high rollers requested. Those were the dealers he considered for special assignments, for the private games where real money changed hands. After 18 months, I was one of the Golden Palace's most trusted dealers, someone management knew they could put on any game without worry. Patricia told me I was being considered for promotion to lead dealer, a position that came with better pay and more responsibility. I declined, politely, carefully, explaining that I preferred dealing to managing, that I liked the interaction with players, that I wasn't interested in the administrative side. This was the right move. Vincent wanted dealers who loved the game itself, who were committed to the craft rather than climbing the ladder. That's when I started studying Vincent's private games more systematically. Once or twice a month, Vincent hosted a high-stakes poker game in that private room on the top floor. The games were invitation only, supposedly for Vincent's friends and business associates, but really they were hunting expeditions. Vincent would identify wealthy players, usually businessmen from out of town with money to spend and egos to feed, and invite them to exclusive games where they'd be systematically cheated. I learned the schedule by watching patterns, noticing when certain employees were called in for special shifts, when security protocols changed, when the private elevator was in use. I learned who the regular players were by listening to dealer gossip, by piecing together fragments of conversation, by paying attention to which high rollers were at the casino on those key nights. The method was sophisticated. Vincent played with 3 or 4 confederates, men who appeared to be independent wealthy players but were actually working with him. They used signals to share information about their cards, subtle gestures that looked natural but conveyed specific information. A hand touching a watch meant high cards, scratching a neck meant medium cards, doing nothing meant low cards. The dealer controlled the mechanics, managing shuffles and cuts in ways that seemed random but actually stacked the deck in favor of Vincent's team. Not blatantly, not every hand, but often enough to create a significant edge. Combined with the shared information from signals, it gave Vincent's team an overwhelming advantage over the mark. Security cameras in the private room were carefully managed, angled to miss key sight lines, conveniently malfunctioning during crucial hands. The recordings that did exist showed nothing suspicious, just a regular poker game with normal variants. I learned all this by watching, listening, piecing together fragments. The dealers who worked those private games were well paid and carefully selected. They never talked directly about cheating, but they didn't have to. I saw how they were scheduled, how they were compensated, how they were protected. I saw Frank Morrison leave those games with envelopes of cash, saw how he was treated by management, understood his role in the operation. I needed to work one of those games. That was my way in, my chance to gather evidence and destroy Vincent from the inside. But getting selected meant being trusted completely, and trust took time. I spent another year being perfect. Never late, never made mistakes, never caused problems. I cultivated relationships with the shift managers, made myself indispensable, became the dealer they called when they needed reliability. I turned down better-paying jobs at other casinos, showed loyalty that seemed genuine because on the surface it was. I pretended the Golden Palace was my career, my home, my future. I also started building relationships with some of Vincent's regular players, the legitimate high rollers who weren't part of the rigged games. I learned their preferences, remembered their drink orders, made small talk about their businesses and families. I became a known quantity, someone they were comfortable with, someone who made their experience at the casino better. This was important because Vincent asked his regular players about dealers before selecting them for private games. He wanted dealers the high rollers trusted, dealers who wouldn't make marks suspicious. When Frank Morrison had a heart attack and couldn't work anymore, I was the obvious replacement. The shift manager called me into her office, told me I'd been selected for special assignments, that the pay would be significantly better, but the games required absolute discretion. Mr. Calabrese runs some private games, Patricia said, watching my reaction carefully. High stakes, important clients. We need dealers who are skilled and completely professional. You've proven yourself over the past 3 years. Several of our regular players have specifically mentioned you as someone they enjoy playing with. Interested, I pretended to consider it, like this wasn't the opportunity I'd been working toward for 7 years. Absolutely. When do I start? Next Thursday. Game starts at 8 p.m. You'll meet Mr. Calabrese briefly before the game. He likes to know who's dealing. Dress sharp, be on time, and remember that everything that happens in that room is confidential. We've had dealers fired for talking about these games. Understood, I said. My first private game was 2 weeks later. I arrived an hour early, dressed in my best suit, mentally prepared for what was coming. Patricia met me at the private elevator, used her key card to send me to the top floor. The private gaming room was elegant, with paneled walls, leather chairs, a custom poker table that probably cost more than I'd made in the past year. Vincent was already there, setting up bottles of expensive whiskey, arranging cigars, preparing for his guests. He looked older than in the photos I'd studied, grayer, heavier, but still projecting that same casual authority. He looked at me with the same assessing gaze he probably used on everyone, sizing me up, deciding if I was useful. "You're Tommy," he said. It wasn't a question. Yes, sir. Mr. Calabrese. Patricia speaks highly of you. Says you're reliable, discreet, good with high rollers. He poured 2 glasses of whiskey, handed me one. These games are important to me. The players are friends, business associates, people I value. I need a dealer who can keep the game running smoothly, who can handle the stakes without getting nervous, who understands that what happens here stays here. Can you do that? Yes, sir, I said, meeting his eyes. This was the man who'd killed my father, sitting 3 feet away, completely unaware of who I really was or why I was there. Good. He smiled, raised his glass. To discretion. I raised mine. To discretion. The whiskey tasted like ash in my mouth. The game started at 8. 8 players total, including Vincent. I recognized 3 of them from my research as his regular confederates. Michael Zhang, a supposed tech entrepreneur who actually made his money from various cons. Robert Delacroix, a real estate developer who specialized in questionable deals. And David Park, who claimed to be an import-export but was really just Vincent's bagman. The mark was obvious from the moment he walked in. His name was James Morrison, no relation to Frank, a construction company owner from Philadelphia. He was wealthy, confident, excited to be playing in such an exclusive game. He wore an expensive suit that didn't quite fit right, laughed too loud at Vincent's jokes, ordered the most expensive whiskey available. Perfect victim, just like my father had been. I dealt poker, watched the dynamics, saw the system in action. The signals were exactly as I'd learned, subtle but consistent. Michael touched his watch. Vincent organized his chips in a specific pattern. Information flowed around the table invisible to James, but clear to anyone who knew the code. I controlled the shuffle and cut exactly as Frank had trained the previous dealers, creating situations where Vincent's team had better information and better cards more often than random chance would allow. Not every hand. That would be too obvious. But enough hands to create a consistent edge. Over 5 hours, James lost $60,000. He'd come in confident, left shell-shocked, convinced he'd just had bad luck, that he'd been outplayed by more experienced players. He had no idea he'd been systematically cheated, that every element of the game had been designed to extract his money. Vincent was gracious in victory, offered James a chance to play again, said everyone has rough nights, that the cards would turn eventually. James agreed, said he'd be back next month, that he wanted a chance to win his money back. He wouldn't win it back. He'd lose more, then more again, until he was tapped out or smart enough to walk away. That's how Vincent's system worked. Keep the marks coming back, keep them believing their luck would change, keep extracting money until there was nothing left to take. After the game ended and the players left, Vincent counted the money with Michael and Robert. They split their winnings, casual and comfortable, discussing the game like businessmen reviewing a successful quarter. New dealer worked out well, Vincent said. Kept things moving, didn't make Morrison suspicious. Frank was better at the shuffle control, Michael said. But Tommy's good enough. We should keep him. Vincent nodded. Patricia was right about him. He'll work out. I cleaned up the room, stacked chips, collected empty glasses, played my role perfectly. Inside, I was documenting everything, memorizing every detail, building my case. I dealt 3 more of those games over the next 2 months, each following the same pattern. Different marks, same method. A nervous doctor from Boston who lost $40,000. A confident lawyer from New York who lost $80,000 over 2 games. A retired CEO from Connecticut who lost $120,000 before his wife made him stop. Vincent was making hundreds of thousands of dollars from these rigged games, maybe millions over the years he'd been running them. And I was documenting everything. I couldn't use phone cameras or recording devices. Security was too tight, and my room was almost certainly monitored. But I had something better, a photographic memory I'd spent years training specifically for this purpose. After each game, I'd go home and write down every hand, every bet, every signal, every manipulation. I documented patterns that proved the games were rigged, odds that broke so consistently in Vincent's favor that they were statistically impossible. I reconstructed complete games from memory, wrote down exact sequences of cards, betting patterns, player behaviors. I noted when the odds deviated from expectation, when Vincent's team won hands they statistically shouldn't have, when the shuffle and cut resulted in suspiciously advantageous card distributions. I also identified all of Vincent's confederates, learned their signals, understood their system completely. I knew how they communicated, how they coordinated, how they covered their tracks. I documented their roles, their relationships with Vincent, their financial arrangements. After 6 months of dealing private games, I had documentation of dozens of rigged hands across 15 games. I had analysis proving the games were systematically cheating marks out of hundreds of thousands of dollars. I had identified 5 regular confederates and documented their signals and methods. I had everything I needed to destroy Vincent Calabrese. Now I needed to decide how to use it. I could go to the Gaming Commission again, but they'd already dismissed my father's complaint years ago. The investigator who'd handled our case was likely compromised, possibly still involved in Vincent's operation. Going through official channels had failed before and would probably fail again. I could go to the police, but Vincent had connections there too. He donated to police benevolent associations, attended fundraisers, cultivated relationships with officers and detectives. Local law enforcement was unlikely to pursue a case against someone with his influence. I could go public, leak my documentation to the media, but without credible backing or corroboration, I'd just be a disgruntled dealer making accusations against a respected businessman. Vincent's lawyers would destroy me, and the story would disappear. I needed something more strategic, something that would destroy Vincent without giving him a chance to cover up or deflect. I needed institutional power behind me, federal resources, investigators who couldn't be bought or intimidated. I needed the FBI. But the FBI doesn't investigate based on one person's claims, especially not a casino dealer with obvious motive to lie. I needed more. I needed witnesses, multiple sources, a pattern too clear to ignore. So I targeted Vincent's confederates first. I approached Michael Zhang at a public poker tournament in Atlantic City. I'd done my research on Michael, knew his weaknesses, knew what leverage would work. He was ambitious, always looking for the next opportunity, always worried about getting caught. He was a coward at heart, someone who participated in Vincent's schemes because the money was good, but who would abandon ship the moment things got dangerous. I sat down next to him casually, played a few hands of low-stakes poker, then said quietly, "I know about the signals. The private games. Everything." Michael's face went pale. His hand froze halfway to his chips. "I don't know what you're talking about. You signal high cards by touching your watch. Medium cards by scratching your neck. Low cards by doing nothing. Vincent signals back with chip movements. I've dealt 30 of your games. I know the whole system." I laid down my cards, folded a decent hand to show I wasn't interested in the poker game. I know about the shuffle control, the security camera management, the split of winnings. I have documentation of every game I've dealt, complete hand-by-hand reconstruction with statistical analysis proving the rigging. Michael stood up to leave. I said calmly, "Sit down. I'm not here to threaten you. I'm here to offer you a choice." He sat slowly, his eyes darting around looking for security or exits or Vincent's other confederates. "What do you want?" "Vincent killed my father. Maybe not directly, but he cheated him out of everything in one of these rigged games 7 years ago. My father drank himself to death because of it. So I want Vincent to pay for what he's done. You're going to help me." "Why would I do that?" "Because if you don't, I take this documentation to the FBI, to the State Gaming Commission, to every news outlet in the region. You go to prison for conspiracy to commit fraud, lose everything, spend years fighting charges. Your tech company, which is barely legitimate anyway, gets investigated. Your finances get examined. Everything you've built comes apart." I paused, let that sink in. "Or you cooperate, provide testimony against Vincent, and walk away with immunity. Maybe even witness protection if you're that worried about retaliation. You flip on Vincent, help bring him down, and you get to keep your life. Vincent will kill me if I testify against him. Vincent will be too busy fighting federal charges to worry about you. And by the time he gets out of prison, if he ever does, you'll be long gone. New city, new life, new identity if necessary. The FBI is good at protecting cooperating witnesses." Michael thought about it for a long time, his mind clearly racing through options and consequences. Finally, he said, "What exactly do you need from me?" "Everything. How long you've been working with Vincent, how the system works, how many marks you've helped cheat, how much money you've made. Complete testimony about the methods, the signals, the coordination. Everything that will help federal prosecutors build a case." "And you can guarantee immunity?" "I can guarantee that cooperating is your best option. Fighting this will destroy you. Vincent's going down regardless of whether you help. The question is whether you go down with him or walk away clean. Michael agreed to meet again in 2 days. He wanted time to think, to consider his options, to maybe talk to a lawyer. I gave him that time, confident that the more he thought about it, the more he'd realize cooperation was his only viable path. 2 days later, we met at a coffee shop in Philadelphia, far from Atlantic City and Vincent's network. Michael brought a lawyer, a criminal defense attorney who specialized in white-collar crime. The lawyer asked me pointed questions about my evidence, about federal interest in the case, about the deal I was offering. I showed them enough documentation to prove I wasn't bluffing, explained that I hadn't approached the FBI yet because I wanted witnesses first, laid out exactly what Michael's cooperation would mean for the case. The lawyer advised Michael to cooperate. Your client has significant exposure here, he told Michael. Federal fraud charges, conspiracy, potentially RICO violations if they want to go big. Mr. Reeves is offering a way out. I strongly recommend taking it. Michael agreed to cooperate fully, to provide testimony, to help build the case against Vincent. He was the first domino. Over the next 3 months, I flipped 3 more of Vincent's confederates using similar approaches. Each one was given the same choice: cooperate or go down with Vincent. Each one, after consulting with lawyers and considering their options, chose cooperation. Robert Delacroix was the hardest to flip. He had more resources than Michael, better lawyers, more to lose. But he also had a wife and kids he wanted to protect, and I used that. You go to prison for fraud, your wife loses the house, your kids grow up visiting dad in federal lockup. Or you cooperate, testify, and maybe you keep something. Maybe you get to be there for your family. That was enough. Robert agreed to cooperate. David Park flipped easily. He was just Vincent's employee really, didn't have the same emotional investment in the operation. When I explained the case against him and the deal available, he agreed almost immediately. By the time I approached the FBI, I had 4 cooperating witnesses, hundreds of pages of documentation, and statistical analysis that proved beyond any doubt that Vincent's games were rigged. With their testimony, I had everything needed for federal prosecution. I contacted the FBI field office in Philadelphia, asked to speak to someone in their white-collar crime division. I was transferred to Special Agent Lisa Park, no relation to David, who specialized in gaming fraud. I have evidence of systematic fraud at the Golden Palace Casino in Atlantic City, I told her. Multiple witnesses willing to testify, documentation of rigged games going back months, statistical proof of cheating. The casino owner, Vincent Calabrese, has been running illegal gambling operations disguised as private poker games. Agent Park was skeptical at first. Casino fraud cases are complicated, hard to prove, and Vincent had avoided consequences before. But when I showed her the initial evidence, introduced her to Michael Zhang, who was willing to testify immediately, explained the scope of the operation, her skepticism shifted to serious interest. "Why are you doing this?" she asked during our second meeting. "You've spent years building this case, gathering evidence, flipping witnesses. You could have blackmailed Calabrese, could have made serious money keeping quiet. Why bring it to us?" "He killed my father," I said simply. 7 years ago, Vincent cheated my father out of everything in one of these rigged games. My father drank himself to death because of it. This isn't about money. It's about justice. It's about making sure Vincent Calabrese faces consequences for what he's done. Agent Park looked at me for a long moment. "You understand that federal prosecution moves slowly. Building a case this size could take months, maybe over a year. During that time, you'll need to continue working at the Golden Palace, continue dealing those games, continue documenting everything. Can you do that?" "I've been doing it for years," I said. "I can keep doing it as long as necessary." The FBI investigation took 8 months. They brought in forensic accountants to trace Vincent's finances, gaming experts to analyze the statistical patterns, analysts who could prove the mathematical impossibility of Vincent's winning streaks. They interviewed dozens of players who'd lost money in the private games, many of whom hadn't realized they'd been cheated until investigators showed them the patterns. During those 8 months, I continued dealing Vincent's games, continued documenting everything, continued playing my role as a trusted employee. It was the hardest 8 months of the process, knowing the investigation was ongoing, knowing that discovery was coming, but having to pretend everything was normal. I dealt games where Marks lost $50,000, $80,000, $100,000. I watched Vincent and his Confederates count their winnings, laugh about the easy money, plan their next targets. I smiled and nodded and did my job perfectly while documenting every detail for federal prosecutors. The FBI built a case that was overwhelming, undeniable, prosecutable. They had testimony from 4 cooperating witnesses. They had documentation of dozens of rigged games. They had statistical analysis proving the impossibility of Vincent's results. They had financial records showing millions of dollars in unexplained income. They had security footage that mysteriously malfunctioned at convenient times. They had everything. Vincent was arrested on a Tuesday morning at his home in a wealthy Atlantic City suburb. Federal agents arrived at 6 a.m. with a warrant, arrested him in front of his wife and children. The charges included wire fraud, conspiracy, racketeering, money laundering, and operating illegal gambling operations. The indictment was 63 pages long, detailing years of systematic cheating, millions of dollars in illegal winnings, dozens of victims. The news coverage was extensive. Vincent Calabrese, respected casino owner and businessman, pillar of the Atlantic City community, major political donor, was actually a sophisticated con artist who'd been cheating players for years. His mugshot was on every news site, his empire in ruins. The Golden Palace was shut down pending investigation. Vincent's other 2 casinos were seized by gaming regulators. His assets were frozen. His life's work, built on fraud and theft, collapsed in days. Federal agents arrested Michael Zhang, Robert Delacroix, and David Park simultaneously, a coordinated sweep designed to prevent them from fleeing or destroying evidence. All 3 immediately cooperated, as they'd agreed, providing detailed testimony about Vincent's operation. Donald Pierce, the Gaming Commission investigator who dismissed my father's complaint, was also arrested. The FBI had discovered his involvement in the rigged games, his role in covering up complaints, his financial relationship with Vincent. He faced charges of corruption and obstruction of justice. I should have felt satisfied watching this unfold. I destroyed the man who killed my father, exposed his crimes, ensured he'd spend years in prison. But mostly I felt empty, because none of it brought my father back, none of it returned the years we lost, none of it undid the damage. Vincent's trial lasted 6 weeks. The prosecution's case was meticulous and overwhelming. They presented the documentation I'd gathered, showed the statistical impossibility of Vincent's results, had the cooperating witnesses testify about the methods and the conspiracy. They showed the jury exactly how the rigged games worked, demonstrated the signals, explained the shuffle control. Vincent's lawyers tried various defenses, argued that the games were legal private poker games, that Vincent was just a skilled player, that the cooperating witnesses were lying to save themselves. None of it worked. The evidence was too strong. The patterns too clear. The testimony too consistent. The jury saw through every defense, recognized the systematic fraud for what it was. I attended every day of the trial. Vincent saw me there, but didn't recognize me at first. I was just another observer, just someone interested in the case. But on the 3rd week, during a break, our eyes met across the courtroom and something clicked. He stared at me, his face going pale, and I saw the moment of recognition. He knew. He understood who I was, whose son I was, what I'd done. I saw recognition, then rage, then something like respect. He'd been beaten, completely and thoroughly, by the son of a man he'd barely remembered cheating. During a recess that afternoon, Vincent's lead attorney approached me in the hallway. "My client would like to speak with you. Privately, off the record. Would you be willing?" I considered refusing. What was there to say? But curiosity won. 5 minutes. They arranged a meeting in a private conference room, Vincent in handcuffs, 2 federal marshals standing guard. He looked older than he had at the Golden Palace, the trial and imprisonment aging him rapidly. "Robert Reeves was your father," he said. It wasn't a question. Yes. I barely remembered him. Had to look through old files to find the game. 7 years ago, private game, lost 50,000. He shook his head. "You did all this because of that." "I did all this because you killed my father. He drank himself to death after you cheated him. Spent 3 years destroying himself because you stole everything he had. I cheated a lot of people. Your father wasn't special. He was to me." Vincent laughed bitterly. "You spent 7 years on this. Became a dealer, infiltrated my operation, flipped my people, built a federal case. That's dedication. That's justice. That's revenge. He leaned forward. You know what's funny? I probably wouldn't have even remembered your father if you hadn't done all this. He was just another mark, another $50,000. But now he's the reason I'm going to prison. Now his name is in a federal indictment. You made him matter by destroying me. He always mattered. You just didn't care. True enough. Vincent was quiet for a moment. For what it's worth, I'm sorry about your father. Not sorry enough to have stopped cheating people, but sorry that one of them drank himself to death over it. That wasn't the goal. What was the goal? Money. Power. Winning. He shrugged. I liked beating people. Liked being smarter than them. Liked taking their money and knowing they'd never figure out how. Your father was collateral damage in a game I was playing. That game is over. Yeah. He smiled without humor. You won. Congratulations. Hope it was worth 7 years of your life. The trial concluded 3 days later. The jury convicted Vincent on all counts. The judge sentenced him to 18 years in federal prison and ordered him to pay restitution to victims totaling $12 million. Given Vincent's age and health problems that were emerging, 18 years was essentially a life sentence. I sat in the courtroom as they led him away in chains and felt nothing. No satisfaction, no triumph, no sense of completion. Just emptiness where the anger had been. After the trial, Agent Park asked me what I'd do now. You're a skilled dealer, she said. You could work anywhere, make good money. What's next for you? I don't know, I admitted. I've spent 7 years focused on this. Now that it's done, I need to figure out who I am beyond revenge. I ended up leaving the casino industry entirely. Too many memories, too much association with what I'd done. I went back to school using money from a victim compensation fund that the court had established. I studied mathematics and statistics, got a degree in data science, found work analyzing patterns for a financial services company. It was honest work, using the same skills I developed for revenge, but applying them to legitimate purposes. I was good at it, found satisfaction in solving problems, in finding patterns in complex data. I also started working with gambling addiction organizations, helping people who'd lost everything to casinos. I understood that trap, had watched my father fall into it. I could use that experience to help others avoid the same fate. I volunteered at recovery centers, shared my story selectively, helped people understand how casinos work and why the odds are designed to take your money. 3 years after Vincent's conviction, I received a letter from him. Prison mail, carefully screened. He wrote that he'd had time to think, to understand what he'd done. He listed the people he'd cheated, the lives he'd destroyed, the damage he'd caused. My father's name was near the top of the list. I remember Robert Reeves now, he wrote. I've thought about him a lot in here. About how he came to my casino with hope, with money he couldn't afford to lose, with trust that the game would be fair. And I cheated him, took everything he had, and sent him away broken. I didn't think about what happened to him after. Didn't care. He was just money to me. I know now that he wasn't just money. He was a person, a father, someone with a son who loved him enough to spend 7 years destroying me. That says something about who he was, about what you lost when I broke him. I'm sorry. I know that doesn't fix anything, doesn't undo the harm, doesn't bring him back. But I want you to know that I understand what I did now. I destroyed lives for profit. I killed your father as surely as if I'd poisoned him. And you made me pay for it. That was justice. I read the letter 3 times, then put it in a drawer. Vincent's understanding came too late to matter, his apology meaningless after what he'd done. But I kept the letter anyway. Proof that he knew, that he understood, that the revenge had been complete. For years after Vincent's conviction, I got a call from Agent Park. Thought you'd want to know, she said. We just closed another case based on your testimony and methodology. A casino in Las Vegas was running similar rigged games. Your documentation helped us identify the pattern faster. We shut them down, arrested 4 people, seized $10 million in assets. You probably saved dozens of potential victims. That felt more meaningful than Vincent's imprisonment. Not just punishing one bad actor, but disrupting a pattern, preventing future harm. My father's death hadn't just resulted in one man's conviction. It had helped expose a broader problem, had protected people who'd never know they'd been in danger. 5 years after Vincent's arrest, several of his victims filed civil lawsuits seeking additional compensation beyond the court-ordered restitution. They asked me to testify as an expert witness, to explain how the rigged games worked, to help prove their cases. I agreed, spent weeks in depositions and court appearances, helped them understand what had been done to them. One of those victims was a man named Charles Whitmore, who'd lost $200,000 in Vincent's games. He'd mortgaged his house to play, convinced he could win, trapped in the same cycle that had killed my father. "Thank you," he said after his case settled favorably, "for exposing what Calabrese did, for making it possible for us to get something back. My marriage almost ended because of those losses. My kids almost lost their college funds. But because of your investigation, because you documented everything so carefully, we recovered enough to survive." Conversations like that made the 7 years feel worthwhile. Not because I destroyed Vincent, but because I protected others, had given victims a path to recovery, had turned personal tragedy into collective justice. 6 years after my father's death sent me on this path, I met Sarah at a Gamblers Anonymous meeting where I was speaking. She was there supporting her brother who developed a gambling problem after losing his job. We started talking after the meeting, went for coffee, discovered we had similar experiences with how gambling had impacted our families. Sarah understood my story in ways most people couldn't. She'd watched her brother spiral, had tried to help him, had learned about addiction and recovery. She didn't judge the revenge I'd pursued, didn't think it was wrong or excessive. She just asked if it had given me peace. Not peace, I admitted, but closure. I know I did everything I could. I made sure my father's death meant something, that Vincent faced consequences, that future victims were protected. That's not peace, but it's something. "That's enough," she said. "Sometimes that has to be enough." We dated carefully, slowly, both of us cautious about trust and commitment. But Sarah was patient, understanding, willing to accept my complicated past and the person it had made me. 2 years later, we married in a small ceremony, my father's memory present in every moment, even though he couldn't be there physically. 7 years after Vincent's conviction, I published a book about casino fraud, about how sophisticated cheating works, about the psychology of marks and con artists. I changed names and details to protect privacy, but the core story was there. How my father was cheated, how I infiltrated the operation, how I brought down the people responsible. I dedicated the book to Robert Reeves, the man who'd taught me about probability and patience, whose death had taught me about injustice and determination. The book did well, became required reading in some gaming security programs, helped train a new generation of regulators and investigators. Victims of gambling fraud reached out, thanking me for exposing the industry's dark side. Parents of gambling addicts reached out, saying the book helped them understand what their children were facing. I gave talks at colleges, at casino security conferences, at FBI training sessions. I helped people understand how cons work, how to recognize manipulation, how to protect themselves from sophisticated fraud. I turned my father's death into education, my revenge into prevention. 8 years after my father died, I stood at his grave on the anniversary of his death. I brought flowers, stood in silence, told him about Vincent's conviction, about the book, about the work I was doing to prevent others from suffering the same fate. "I got him, Dad," I said. "I got him the way you taught me to, with patience and mathematics and careful planning. I beat him at his own game, and I did it without becoming like him. I exposed him without cheating, destroyed him without breaking laws, won without compromising who I am." I paused, feeling the weight of years lift slightly. "I hope that matters. I hope you're proud. I know revenge didn't bring you back, didn't undo the damage. But it meant something. It protected others. It turned your death into something more than just tragedy." The wind rustled through the cemetery trees. I stood there a long time, remembering my father as he'd been before Vincent broke him, honoring the man he'd been rather than the broken person he'd become. 9 years after infiltrating the Golden Palace, I received an invitation to speak at a gaming industry conference. The topic was ethical casino operations, preventing fraud, protecting players. The audience would include casino owners, regulators, security professionals, people who shaped industry standards. I almost declined. The casino world still carried painful associations, still reminded me of my father's loss and the years I'd spent planning revenge. But I accepted, because the work still mattered. Because there were still Vincent Calabreses out there, still rigged games, still people being cheated. At the conference, I met a woman named Linda Torres whose husband had lost their savings in one of Vincent's rigged games 2 years before my father. She'd been too ashamed to come forward during the investigation, too broken by the loss to participate in the trial. But she'd followed the case, had read my book, had finally found the courage to speak about what happened. "Thank you," she said, tears in her eyes. "Thank you for doing what we couldn't do, for fighting back. My husband died thinking he was just a bad poker player, never knowing he'd been cheated. But I know now. Because of you, I know it wasn't his fault. I know he was targeted, manipulated, stolen from. That knowledge doesn't bring him back, but it helps. I'm sorry for your loss," I said. "And I'm sorry I couldn't expose Vincent earlier, before your husband was hurt. You were just a kid when it happened to us. You couldn't have known, couldn't have stopped it. But you stopped him eventually. You made sure he couldn't hurt anyone else. That's what matters." That conversation reminded me why the revenge had been necessary. Not just for my own satisfaction, not just to punish Vincent, but to validate the experiences of other victims, to give them truth where they'd only had shame. 10 years after my father lost everything in that rigged poker game, I could finally say I'd moved past the revenge and into something healthier. I still told the story, still used my experience to educate and protect, but I was no longer defined by what Vincent had done or what I'd done in response. I'd become an expert in gambling fraud, someone who could explain complex cheating simply, who could help people recognize manipulation, who could protect the vulnerable. I'd built a career on using my experience to prevent others from suffering similar fates. My father's death had been meaningless at the time, a casualty of someone else's greed, a tragedy that served no purpose. But my response to it had created meaning, had turned tragedy into purpose, had helped others avoid the same fate. I taught courses on probability and game theory, showing students how to think mathematically about risk and reward. I consulted for casinos that wanted to improve their security, helping them identify vulnerabilities before cheaters could exploit them. I worked with regulators to develop better standards for gaming operations. Every piece of this work traced back to my father, to what he'd taught me, to what his death had forced me to become. 11 years after joining the Golden Palace as a dealer, I received word that Vincent had died in prison. Heart attack, sudden, at age 64. He'd served only 7 years of his 18-year sentence. Several victims expressed anger that he'd escaped full punishment, that death had given him an early release. I felt nothing. Vincent was gone, but the work continued. His death didn't undo what he'd done, didn't return stolen money or broken lives. It was just an ending, not particularly meaningful, not particularly satisfying. Agent Park called me after hearing the news. "How do you feel?" she asked. "Empty," I admitted. I spent 7 years destroying him, 7 more years building something from the wreckage. And now he's just gone. It doesn't feel like closure. It just feels like he stopped existing. "Maybe that's the best revenge," Park said. "Not suffering, not punishment, but irrelevance." He spent his whole life building an empire, creating a reputation, making himself matter. And now he's just gone, barely remembered, his legacy completely erased by what you exposed. She was right. Vincent's casinos were closed, his fortune seized and distributed to victims, his name synonymous with fraud rather than success. He'd built everything on cheating, and when the cheating was exposed, there was nothing left. No legacy, no reputation, no meaning. Just a con artist who got caught. That erasure felt more complete than any punishment could have been. 12 years after my father died, I had a son. We named him Robert, after my father, after the man whose death had shaped so much of my life. Holding him for the first time, I thought about legacy, about what we leave behind, about the stories we pass down. "I'll tell you about your grandfather," I whispered to infant Robert. "About his skill with numbers, his patience, his care. About how he taught me to think, to plan, to never bet more than I could afford to lose. I'll tell you the good parts, the man he was before someone broke him." Sarah stood beside me, her hand on my shoulder. "Will you tell him the rest? About Vincent, about the revenge. Someday, when he's old enough to understand. I'll tell him about injustice and how sometimes you have to fight back. About patience and planning and using your mind to solve problems. About how personal tragedy can become collective protection if you're willing to do the work." That's a heavy story for a child. It's the truth. And he deserves truth, even when it's complicated. 15 years after my father walked into the Golden Palace with everything we owned, I stood in front of a college auditorium full of students studying criminology and mathematics. I was there to give a guest lecture about fraud investigation, about pattern recognition, about using data analysis to expose sophisticated crimes. I told them my father's story, about the rigged game, the destroyed life, the years of planning that followed. I explained how I'd used mathematics and patience to infiltrate Vincent's operation, how I'd documented everything systematically, how I'd built a case that federal prosecutors could use. But I also talked about cost, about the 7 years I'd spent focused on revenge to the exclusion of everything else, about the relationships I'd neglected, the opportunities I'd missed, the person I'd become in pursuit of vengeance. Revenge is expensive, I told them. Emotionally, practically, spiritually expensive. It will consume your life if you let it. And even when you win, even when you completely destroy the person who hurt you, it won't feel the way you imagine. So why do it? A student asked. Because sometimes revenge isn't about satisfaction. It's about prevention. It's about exposing patterns so others don't suffer the same harm. It's about creating accountability and systems that protect powerful people. I paused. But if you choose that path, understand what you're choosing. Make sure you're doing it for the right reasons. Not just to hurt them, but to protect others. Not just to destroy, but to build something better afterward. Did you build something better? Another student asked. I tried. The investigation exposed casino fraud more broadly, led to regulatory reforms, helped train investigators to recognize rigging patterns. My father's death, which was meaningless tragedy, became part of a system that protects other potential victims. That's not sufficient compensation for what was lost, but it's something. 20 years after that night, when my father came home from the Golden Palace looking a decade older, I could finally say I understood what revenge had taught me. Not that vengeance brings peace, it doesn't. Not that destroying enemies provides satisfaction, it doesn't. But that pain, properly channeled, can become protection. That personal tragedy can inform collective justice. That one person's suffering, when documented and shared, can prevent future suffering. Vincent Calabrese had killed my father by cheating him, by taking everything he had, by breaking his spirit so completely that alcohol became his only escape. That was real harm, real injustice, real evil. My response had been methodical, mathematical, patient. 7 years of preparation, 7 more years of building on the foundation that revenge had created. I'd exposed Vincent, destroyed his empire, sent him to prison. But more than that, I'd created systems that protected others, educated people about fraud, turned my experience into expertise that served the public good. That was revenge that mattered. Not because it hurt Vincent, though it had, but because it prevented future Vincents from causing future harm. Because it validated other victims, protected potential targets, reformed broken systems. My father had taught me to think mathematically, to be patient, to plan carefully. I'd used those lessons to destroy the man who killed him, but I'd also used them to build something meaningful from the wreckage, to ensure his death had purpose beyond just tragedy. And that, finally, was enough. Not complete, not perfect, not sufficient to balance the scales entirely, but enough to live with, enough to build on, enough to call justice. I was no longer the broken 19-year-old standing at his father's funeral swearing revenge. I was a husband, a father, a teacher, an expert in fraud prevention. I'd been shaped by tragedy and driven by vengeance. But I'd emerged as someone who protected others, who built rather than just destroyed, who channeled pain into purpose. My father would have been proud of that. Not the revenge itself, necessarily, but what came after. The teaching, the writing, the prevention. He'd always believed in using your mind to solve problems, in careful analysis over emotional reaction, in building something that lasted. I'd honored that, even as I'd pursued revenge. I'd used every lesson he'd taught me, every skill he'd helped me develop, every value he'd instilled. And I'd turned his meaningless death into meaningful protection for others. That was my revenge. Not destroying Vincent, though I'd done that, but building a legacy for my father that transcended his death, that turned tragedy into purpose, that protected the vulnerable and exposed the corrupt. 22 years after it all began, I could finally say I was at peace with what I'd done. The anger was gone, replaced by understanding. The obsession was gone, replaced by purpose. The emptiness was gone, replaced by the quiet satisfaction of work that mattered. I'd gotten my revenge. But more importantly, I'd gotten justice. And in the end, justice was what my father would have wanted. Not suffering for its own sake, but accountability. Not destruction for vengeance, but protection for others. I'd given him that, and it was enough.